Hello, this is your host, Sheila Bender, and I am pleased to be here today with author Barbara Sjoholm. Before we talk with Barbara, I'd like to tell you a little bit about her. Barbara Sjoholm's most recent publication is The Palace of the Snow Queen, Winter Travels in Lapland. She has previously published both fiction and nonfiction, including The Pirate Queen, In Search of Grace O'Malley and Other Legendary Women of the Sea, and a memoir about growing up as a Christian Scientist, Blue Windows. She's also written half a dozen mysteries. One of the mysteries, Gaudy Afternoon, won an award from the British Crime Writers Association and was filmed with Judy Davis and Marcia Gay Harden. She's also been nominated twice in the field of creative nonfiction for the Penn Center USA Award. She's been a MacDowell Fellow and received grants from the Seattle Arts Commission, the Danish Arts Fund, and the American Scandinavian Foundation. In addition to books, she has published travel articles and essays in American Scholar, Smithsonian, the New York Times, and Slate, among others. She co-founded Seal Press when she was 25 and worked there for 20 years as a publisher and editor. She continued to be the director of Women in Translation, a nonprofit press, until 2004. She has published several translations from Norwegian and is working on a book by a Danish author to be published by the University of Wisconsin Press. Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Sheila.
Welcome to the studio today. I'm excited to talk to you about writing. You've certainly been prolific in these years. So I thought maybe we could start with memoir. Tell us a little bit about Blue Windows, how you came to write it. And I know there's one we didn't mention in the bio called Incognito Street. Both of those books are favorites of mine. So I would like to know, as a writer and for listeners, what brought you to memoir?
Well, I had started out as a writer, writing autobiographical short stories. Like lots of writers, I wrote about what I knew. So I had written quite a bit about growing up in Southern California with my younger brother and in a family that was Christian Science. And my mother had died when I was 12. But I found it very difficult to actually approach the harder parts of some of that. And I had been thinking about it for many years. I had been interested in narrative nonfiction, but I had been very busy writing other things, also running a publishing company, traveling and whatnot. And of course, writing memoir is hard work. It's excavating the past, it's doing research. And so it wasn't until I was in my 40s that I actually felt like I had some space and time to really do some research about Christian Science, interview people who had known my mother, and look through a lot of old material before I began to write.
It's interesting that you say memoir is hard work because, of course, I think that researching for nonfiction as well as coming up with stories for fiction is hard work. And I do notice that the two memoirs, Blue Windows and Incognito Street, are at least published many years apart. How many years are between those two?
I think about 9.
And in that 9 years, you have done a lot of writing. So perhaps you'd like to tell us what occurred between the publication of those two memoirs.
After I finished writing Blue Windows, I did a few other things, but I had kind of gotten the nonfiction bug, and I had also been very interested in travel writing, and in travel writing that kind of combined travel and memoir. So I had been wanting to take a big journey, and I set off in 1999, I think, to the north. I had been interested in the whole subject of women in the sea and why there was so little written about women in the sea when I knew there were many wonderful legends and historical facts.
How did you become interested in this women in the sea in particular as opposed to women in other areas?
Well, I loved boats. Maybe I should just start there. I'd grown up in a harbor city, and I had also worked on a ship in Norway one summer, on the Hurtigruten, the Kong Olav, as a dishwasher. And I think that I just started noticing. I'd always read seafaring literature, and I started noticing that there wasn't much historically available. And one of the women who interested me most, who was kind of the keystone of the book, was Grace O'Malley, who was pirate and Irish chieftain. And I thought her story definitely needs to be known, and I'm sure there are many, many others. So I set off. I had some money from a movie that had been made of one of my books, and I thought, I'm going to use this and have this an adventure. So I set off for 3 or 4 months, and I went all through Scotland and Ireland and the Orkneys and the Shetlands, all by boat. I went over to Iceland, back to Norway, and I collected stories in a very idiosyncratic way. So there's actually a lot of me in the book, too.
So now what are you doing?
Well, for me, one thing kind of leads to the next, and I had always been interested in Scandinavia. I went to be an au pair there and ended up staying 10 months when I was in my early 20s, and I had learned Norwegian. I had translated, and I'd always been very interested in translation. So one of the other things I did around 2001 was take another very long trip, and this time I went up to the far north of Scandinavia in the winter, and I spent 4 months there in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And as a result of that, I became quite interested in the Sami people, and particularly a Danish ethnographer and painter named Amelia de Monthat. And pretty much a lot of the work I've been doing in the last 5 years has been around her.
So that necessitates more trips to Scandinavia?
Yeah, I've been there pretty much every year for the last 10 years for a month or two.
So it's wonderful. Your writing project that got filmed, funded trips that have resulted in more writing and more books.
It seems to work like that.
So being a travel writer is a kind of amalgam of all the kinds of writing that you've done.
Yeah.
So
right.
We should talk a little bit about translation and also about your mysteries. You mentioned that as a young woman you learned Norwegian. And when you were doing translation, are you referring to translating from the Norwegian?
Yes, though I have also been translating from Danish now, too. And they're not so very different. They're spoken quite differently, but they're written in a very similar manner. I enjoy it. There's something about not actually having to invent the subject yourself, but just working with a language that's very pleasing to me.
To make it have the tone and nuances of the original using our language.
Yes, it's a little bit hypnotic in some ways. You're looking at someone else's writing and you're feeling the emotions, and then you're sort of transcribing it into English. And there's something incredibly pleasurable about that. I don't know how to describe it.
It sounds hard, but it's good to hear that it's pleasurable. One of the things that it makes me think is that as a writer, we have to learn to trust our emotions, I think. That our emotions are capturing specifics out in the environment that we're putting into our writing. So it would seem that translation, the way you're talking about it, noting the emotions you're having as you're reading in the native language, must really help as a writer, or being a writer must really help you be a translator, because you have this trust in yourself as the filter for the emotional content.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. I think that if you are a translator, you actually are a writer, because those are your words. They are based on someone else's words, but you're kind of reconstructing it. And so you have to have a sense of style and cadence, and you actually have to have a strong command of the English language and to emotionally feel what you're writing.
I would think that that is also true in your work of telling the story of historical figures like Grace O'Malley. I know that Susan Vreeland, when she was here as our Community Reads author last March, was asked about why she writes historical fiction. And she said, I don't have to make up the stories. And that was a great relief to her as a writer. So you're saying that about translation. But what she does have to do is enter that character's life, as you must have with Grace O'Malley, and really feel and trust that you're feeling something like that original person was feeling in her situations. Do you think so?
I think so. It's a little bit different when you're writing kind of historical nonfiction, because you're using your analytic mind and you're also writing about yourself too. I think when you're writing historical fiction, you really do have to inhabit that character, and certainly she has done that, and many other wonderful writers as well.
So how do you describe then your experience of writing the legend of Grace O'Malley and other women of the sea? Do you have any of that going on when you're writing about them?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I think that I'm captured by the narrative, but I think it's very much my voice, my perspective. there are times when I kind of cross over a little bit more, I think. When I was writing about Leif Erikson's sister, Freydis Eriksdotter, and how she had been maligned in history, and how her travels to Vinland and across the North Atlantic had not been given equal weight with her brothers, I think there it was very easy to identify with her and think about what had happened to her and how people had perceived her.
Well, I think from the start there's some simpatico between you and the women that you want to write about. With Women of the Sea, you say you're always interested in boats, and it seems that these women took it even further, both being on the sea and also being pirates. So did that stretch your personality to be able to write about pirates?
I think being a pirate is really way cool. It's extremely transgressive. And I think part of the reason that people are interested in historical pirates, not so much the Somali pirates of today, but historical pirates and especially women pirates, is that it is a view of womanhood that is very liberating. And so you don't think of it as, sort of harmful or stealing or actually theft on the high seas. You think of it as, wow, she's taking charge, she's taking what she wants, she's dressing as a man, she's slashing and burning. Cool.
Yeah. Exciting. Thank you. And so in the Palace of the Snow Queen, Winter Travels in Lapland, where do you think your simpatico was with the writing?
Well, I think that I traditionally have been really interested in human rights and minority rights, and that's been true since I was a child. And I really dislike people being treated unfairly. And one of the things that struck me when I was up in the north in Lapland is the condition of the Sami. And because they have been there such a long time, 6,000 years, they're really the only indigenous population in Europe. And they have a strong tradition culturally with reindeer, but also without reindeer as fisher people, boat builders, and so on. It was really clear to me that historically they have been treated in an unjust way. And it was still continuing in the ways that tourism was sort of programming the experience that people would have as tourists with the Sami. So I'm not very interested in getting up on my high horse and polemicizing about this, but I think that it kind of is threaded through the book. There are lots of ways to look at the North, and one of the things I was most interested in is this concept that it's empty, that there's nothing there, because in fact there always have been people there since the end of the last ice age. So I think that's part of the book. It's not all. I look at a lot of historical ways of perceiving the North, but I also describe people who I meet. I describe a lot about the building of the ice hotel in Kiruna, Sweden. I visited it several times, the making of it, the high season with tourists, and then it's melting in April, which was also quite wonderful.
So there is something of a genre of ice palaces in the North, right? That's not the only one?
It's the most important one. There are smaller constructions.
So what is the idea behind these?
Well, it's really an impermanent form of artwork. And I think that it came kind of spontaneously from a group of artists in Kiruna who decided to display their paintings in a kind of igloo. And it kind of grew from there. The next year they did more of it, and then they thought, people might like to sleep here. And the next thing you knew, it was sort of a brand supported by Akavit. Now thousands and thousands of people go there, and there is an offshoot in Montreal, I think, or Quebec City.
So when it melts in April, it doesn't totally melt?
It does melt. It goes right back into the river, the Torn River. They have to take out lots of electrical lines and things, but basically it's completely ice and snow.
Again, so they rebuild it.
They rebuild it every year, which is quite magical.
Which is like when we start a new book.
Yes. Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about your mystery writing. Are you still writing mysteries, or have you...
No, I haven't written mysteries for a long time. When I started out writing, when I was in my 20s, I was very interested in fiction, short fiction, and that's what I did. And I thought that it would lead to a novel, and eventually I did write a novel. But I had a publishing company. I was a co-founder of Seal Press, and we were really interested in trying to get it off the ground. We had started out doing letterpress printing, letterpress, poetry, chapbooks, things like that, which weren't great sellers. And I think as we got into our 30s, we started thinking, how can we publish something that would actually make us some money? And one of the things that I struck on was maybe mysteries. And so I thought, I'll write one. And I wrote Murder in the Collective, and that was published in 1984. And to my great surprise, it was a huge success. It was published in England and Germany. It sold thousands of copies. And I kind of went on and did 3 more with that same character. And then I invented another character, Cassandra Riley, who was a translator of Spanish. And I sent her to Spain. I sent her to Transylvania and to Venice. And I had a lot of fun with those mysteries. But I think that I did feel a little bit boxed in as time was going on, because people then considered me only a mystery writer, and that actually hadn't been my intention. My intention had been to explore this genre, to see what it could do, to write feminist and lesbian mysteries, but also to support Seal Press. And, as the years went on, we didn't actually need that kind of support anymore.
So now when you write fiction, what is your focus?
Well, I think that I am interested in historical fiction, and I haven't written very much fiction for about 10 years. I was really interested in exploring narrative nonfiction and the memoir, but I have gone back to fiction, and it's not very autobiographical anymore. I think I seem to have spent that.
And I'm going to ask you a question that comes up for people when they think about characters in fiction. And the question is, are characters parts of ourselves that we create as characters, or are they beings that we channel?
I think it's not either or. I think they're both. I think some characters are more like us, but all characters have something of us in them.
And in your new fiction, in your previous fiction or mysteries, your character was a translator.
Yes.
And you were a translator.
Yes.
Right. So in your fiction today, even though it's less autobiographical, is there a character whose eyes are your eyes, do you think?
No. But I do think that it gives me a chance to explore things that I am interested in, and certain resonances within my own life, things I'm quite fascinated by.
Such as?
Oh, I'm interested in kind of the permeability of character. I think that we change a lot in our lives, and I'm interested in the kind of fiction that would show how circumstances change people. They start out one character, they sort of gradually try on different things. I'm interested, as I get older, also in the whole question of aging. And if you live enough and you live a long enough time, many things happen to you. Are you the same person you were when you were a child? We look at some of that in Memoir, but you can certainly do the same thing in a novel that continues over the space of someone's whole life.
That makes me think about Incognito Street, which is your most recent memoir, and which you said was got published about 9 years after Blue Window. When people ask what memoir is, it's, I think, important to let people know that memoir isn't autobiography. We're not saying I was born and then I lived all these years, did all these things, and now I'm writing this book. There has to be a window in, a focus in. And your 2 books really do have a different focus. So can you briefly say what the focus of Blue Windows, and then the focus of Incognito Street?
Yes. Blue Windows is a novel that's mainly about my childhood and adolescence, and most of it ends by the time I'm 18, though I kind of go on and summarize what happened to me as I grew older. But I think what I really wanted to do in Blue Windows was look at how Christian Science had influenced my grandparents, who were practitioners, and how it had influenced my mother and her circle of friends. And I think that I had always had a really hard time telling the story of what happened to my mother, because she didn't go to the doctor, and she had a breakdown, and then she died very painfully. And it was really hard as a 10 and 12-year-old to witness this. But I didn't talk about it because most people, when I would say Christian Science, they would sort of roll their eyes and say, oh, that's a religion where you don't go to a doctor. So that I would end up feeling like, oh, my mother was an idiot. But of course she wasn't. She was a very intelligent woman who believed in the teachings of the church. And there are many people like that. I've had hundreds and hundreds of letters from people who also grew up as Christian Scientists. So I think that I really needed to look at the whole context of this religion and its kind of interesting and also peculiar beliefs in terms of reality, unreality, and whether the world is a good place or whether it's a bad place. In Christian Science, it's only good. So what do you do when evil and hurtful things happen? Whereas with Incognito Street, I'm looking at myself from the time I was around 20 to the time I was 23. And by that time, I'm in college, I've got a boyfriend, the Vietnam War is happening, and suddenly my grandmother, who I'd always been at odds with, leaves me some money. She's died. She left me $4,000 for my schooling. So, of course, I promptly dropped out of college and went to Europe. And I spent 3 years there. And I was very changed by that. I went to the university in Spain. I lived in Norway. I lived in England. I learned languages. I had many adventures. I kind of started coming to terms with myself as a writer. And I think that's what that memoir is about. It's just 3 years in my life, but it was a very powerful 3 years.
Absolutely. Especially Incognito Street, published more recently. I don't know if the writing is all more recent than the writing for Blue Windows. That would be interesting to know. How long does it really take in your life, do you think, before you're ready to frame a part of it in search of the answer to a question? In the case of Blue Windows, it was, what do you do with the not good or the evil in the world if you're coming from the Christian Scientist background? Incognito Street, you're examining what it was that made you a writer.
Yes.
Right. Did you have a question in there as well, do you think, as you were writing? Or was that the question? How did I do this?
Yeah, I think that I had always wanted to be a writer from the time I was 8 years old. So I've always been curious about that. And I've always wanted to describe that 3-year period when I lived in Europe as well. I had many great anecdotes from that. The kind of ironic thing about it is that I did very little writing during that period. I thought about it all the time. I went to Paris, I was in Barcelona, I wanted to write, but I didn't really know what to write about because I had already ruled out that I could never write about my childhood. And so I was busily trying to have adventures, love affairs, and, frightening adventures, hitchhiking and going to school and meeting people. I was trying to have them desperately so I would have something to write about. But in fact, I didn't do any writing while I was traveling. It was only years later that I kind of would look back on that, and I didn't write about it the way that I thought I would. I wrote about that girl who so desperately wanted to be a writer.
It's a lovely book, and the title comes from an actual street.
Yes, in Oslo, Incognito Street. And I knew as soon as I saw that many years ago that I always wanted to write a book with that title.
So sometimes we're storing up for later to make something of what we're doing. But I know that trip as a young woman to Barcelona led you to Oslo and led you to your lifelong interest in Scandinavia.
It did. Yeah, I've always been quite interested in both those cultures. I've kind of got my Scandinavian side and then I've got my Spanish side.
That's wonderful. And so you do some teaching.
A little bit.
And I know you're very effective at it since I have listened to you at some of the writers' conferences locally. Is there anything you would like to say to those who want to write, whether it's fiction, mysteries, translation, travel memoir, anything that you think might be of value for them to know about themselves as a person who wants to write? It's a kind of a big amorphous area, but sometimes there's some main thing we've noticed as we teach that people might benefit from knowing?
That's so hard to answer, Sheila, because everyone has their own very circuitous route, and that's always fascinating to me. But I think that people who are stubborn, people who are persistent, people who never give up have a much better chance of getting published and really writing what's deep in their hearts. I think that if you're honest, if you challenge yourself, you also have a chance to get to some of that hard stuff and find a way to share it with others and also just make it something that you can look at that's outside yourself. And I think the only other thing is that it's really important to read. And I think that many writers that I come in contact with in classes are not as well read as they could be. And I think that some are avid readers. But I think that if you want to be a writer, you need to know who your influences might be. You need to be learning from those writers. It's, you don't have to take classes, even though we are teachers. We are looking for students. We want to teach. But I think you can also learn just from reading, because those will be your influences.
Well, one of the things I've learned from you today is that paying attention to what I guess in modern language is disconnect. There was a disconnect for you between how you experienced your mother as an intelligent woman and what people would do when they rolled their eyes. And you said, my mother was not a foolish person. She was an intelligent person. So right there, you have something like an irritation between the two. The disconnect between how you experienced it and how people rolled their eyes was a whole book. What I'm hearing from you is to pay attention to those things if you want to write. That treasure might be right there in what you can't make sense of. And also to trust your adventures, to trust that you're doing something because it's exciting. Mm-hmm. And everyday life can be exciting, actually, if you let it be. If you try to look at your world around you through the eyes of somebody else, or do something different than you would normally do, or do it in a different order. And there's a lot of things we can do even from our home that can resemble the kind of adventures you have when you go abroad. It's wonderful to go abroad. But sometimes we have to think, well, I want to write, and here I am in Port Townsend, and what can I do to make my day special? And it may be a walk on the beach, a different beach than you usually go on. It may be a different time of day. It might be talking to somebody and allowing what they have to say to connect with things you've been thinking about, and then to write something from that. Do you agree?
I do, and you can always go to Whidbey Island.
Right, you can go on the Whidbey Island Ferry and imagine if there was Grace O'Malley on the high seas out there. So before we end today, I would like to talk a little bit about your current work with writers in the Author-Editor Clinic, which you established. Would you like to tell us just a touch about that?
The Author-Editor Clinic came out of my work as an editor and publisher with Seal Press, and the idea was to teach editors how to work more effectively with authors, as well as to be a benefit to writers. And so what I do is I work mainly with editors, but authors send us their work and we edit it, and through that and through me supervising the editors, they learn how better to look at important things to do, especially with developmental editing of long-form manuscripts.
The author learns that as well as the editor.
Yes, they both learn it.
Yeah.
That's the idea. And I learn too.
Right. I have used the services of the Author-Editor Clinic, and I know other writers who have, and it is a fabulous way to get the kind of attention to your manuscript that helps. And so that's why I wanted to be sure that you shared that, because with all of your experience establishing a press, adventuring out there into the world, writing in all these different genres, you bring so much to the editors and through them to the authors. And I always like people to know that help is out there. Writing is lonely. We do it ourselves. We create our subjects and carry on. But we need sometimes to touch base with minds outside of our own to see how we're doing, and more than that, to see what to do about it when we haven't put enough on the page, or perhaps put it in the wrong order. I know that you've read with some pretty impressive people in other cities in the United States and probably abroad. Very quickly, how does that feel when you're up there on stage reading with, say, Susan Orlean?
Oh, she was great. I loved her. She's very funny, and she's a delightful person. So that was a real high point.
So you approached that kind of pairing also with a sense of adventure and meeting colleagues.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've met very few famous people who I didn't admire in some way and wasn't totally thrilled to be reading with.
That's so happy to hear. I want to thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your books and experiences and knowledge. Thank you so much. And before we close, I want people to be sure that they can read more about Barbara and her work on her website, which is www.barbarasjoholm.com. And I'm going to spell that for you. BarbarasJoholm.com. Thank you again.
Thank you, Sheila.